BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? Hope everyone had a good weekend. In this episode, we will be revisiting Donald Lee Cheney as a Zodiac killer suspect, analyzing a sample of Richard Gaikowski's voice, and looking at a new set of homicides that could possibly be linked to the Zodiac Killer, as discussed in the book Zodiac Maniac by Glenn Wall. Firstly, the Zodiac Killer was a serial killer who operated in California in 1968 and 69. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. One of the suspects that gets discussed rather frequently these days is Donald Lee Cheney, and of course the largest proponent of this theory is Drew Beeson, author of Sighting In on the Zodiac Killer. He's also the host of the Zodcast, and he did a live stream recently, and I was not a guest on the show, but I appeared in the chat, and we were asking some questions. People in the chat, that is, and then Drew and I had the opportunity to correspond a little bit, and I'll be talking some more about some things that came out as a result of our discussion. But first, to provide some background info on Donald Lee Cheney as a Zodiac Killer suspect, I'm going to go over to a post that was written by Such Bad Handling, and it's called The Case for Involvement Donald Lee Cheney. And it says that Donald Lee Cheney grew up in Bakersfield, California, where Earl M. Price and Company would put out ciphers in the newspaper for people to try and solve for cash prizes. Cheney lived within minutes walking distance of the store. The Zodiac Killer would also go on to write ciphers. Donald Lee Cheney's mother had the maiden name Fryer, spelled F-R-Y-R-E-A-R, but pronounced Fryer, and the Zodiac would abbreviate the word Friday as Fry Night. Friday night he would write Fry Night. John Cheney attended Bakersfield Junior College in the early 1950s with the future journalist Paul Avery. While he was attending Bakersfield Junior College in May of 1953, the theater production of that college put on The Macato, which was referenced by the Zodiac Killer in multiple correspondences. Paul Avery's friends were in the cast. Donald Lee Cheney was an Air Force cadet. He went to flight training school for 2 years in Harlingen, Texas, but he failed to graduate the cadetship. It is unknown if he failed to complete it or he was discharged from the program. And I've heard Drew Beeson talk about this on some previous live streams, saying that almost everybody in the program would go on to become some type of career member of the Air Force or the military, and it was quite odd that he was not able to do so. Don Cheney studied mechanical engineering at Cal Poly Pomona, where he met Santo Panzarella, also known as Sandy, and Ron Allen, Arthur Allen's brother, and that is how he came to know Arthur Lee Allen. Don Cheney was a mechanical engineer and pipe stress analyst, and would have been skilled in mathematics and would have had knowledge of radians, which the Zodiac mentioned in letters, and drafting. He would have known how to use drafting and light tables, and would have had the hand skills necessary to draw very neat letters and lines. And the point about this is not only about writing lines on the letters. One thing that Drew talks about very frequently is that Donald Lee Cheney would have had knowledge of how to use a light table, and it's not proven that the Zodiac Killer wrote his ciphers on the light table, but the letters are very sloppy and the ciphers are very neat, and it's something that has been proposed by Drew that it could be possible that the Zodiac Killer was writing on a light table to create his cryptograms. And you can go over to Google and look at all of them if you want. You can even look at what's featured on the screen here. I completely agree with the statement that the letters are fairly sloppy and the ciphers are neat. The exceptions you might find to the Zodiac Killer's letters being sloppy might be the Melvin Belli letter, which was mailed or came out on December 20th of 1969, as well as the Phillips 66 map that also has very neat handwriting, very neat hand printing. But for the most part, the Zodiac is tilting all of his writing to one side. He is crossing things out. He is using elongated letters, but the ciphers appear to be very precise. Now, this is the stuff, though, that I was actually discussing with Drew most recently, because I'll just read this comment here from Such Bad Handling. Donald Lee Cheney used the phrase slip of the tongue in his interview with Tom Voigt. This fairly uncommon phrase also appears in the Concerned Citizen letter with the 408 cipher key. Also used the uncommon word cogitated in His Name Was Arthur Lee Allen. That's the documentary from 2007. this is what we were discussing, because one thing that I had heard from Drew rather frequently was that there was a book that was written that talked about Gilbert and Sullivan and the Macato that used the word cogitate. It's a very bizarre word. I had never heard of it before, meaning to think deeply or to meditate on. Something would be to cogitate. I've also never used this in conversation. Even after learning the word, I've never heard it in conversation after using the word. And what I told Drew on the live stream was, I've heard you say the name of the book a few times that has this section on the Macato and the word cogitate, and we were able to discuss and find that it's actually from The Story of the Savoy Opera by S.J.A. Fitzgerald. Sometimes his name is written S.J. Adair Fitzgerald, and there's a section there by T.P. O'Connor. But The Story of the Savoy Opera. And what it says is that Gilbert and Sullivan are having this aha light bulb moment to create the Macato, and Arthur Sullivan is actually sitting in a room, and a Japanese sword falls off the wall, a sword that was being used as a wall decoration falls off the wall, and then he begins to cogitate, and then he begins to think deeply and meditate on the subject, and then that is part of the conception of Gilbert and Sullivan's operetta, The Macato, which would be mentioned in multiple letters: the Little List letter written by the Zodiac, the Exorcist letter. And it appears that the Zodiac had some intense familiarity with the Macato. And I was discussing this in a recent interview that I did. I mean, I'm putting out some interviews on the Friday show now with people who are following the Zodiac as well as anything true crime. And what it came down to was, someone said that, well, if their suspect were the Zodiac, he would have to have been familiar with the Macato, or a very big fan of it. I was like, now wait a second. All of the Macato references appear to come a little bit after the crimes have taken place. For example, when the Zodiac Killer is approaching Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard at Lake Berryessa, or Darlene Ferret and Mike Michaud at Blue Rock Springs, in the surviving witness statements, we don't necessarily hear someone making quotations from the Macato. The Zodiac Killer also made phone calls after he committed his crimes, and he's not exactly saying that, oh, I'm the Lord High Executioner from the Macato or something like that, or he's not using Macato quotations. Now, it appears at some point the author and creator of the Zodiac persona had some type of exposure to the Macato, absolutely, but was it this guy's favorite production? That we don't know yet. But back to this word cogitate. It is a very bizarre word to use in conversation and regular discussions. And if I understand Drew Beeson's take on the subject, he's looking at the idea of how Don Cheney could be leaving little hints or suggestions that he was the Zodiac Killer. However, he might not have wanted to have the spotlight completely on him, and definitely not get convicted for the crimes. He simply wants to throw people off, but also leave these little pieces of information that can suggest that he was the killer, hiding in plain sight, if you will, so to speak. And one thing that Drew points out from Don Cheney's interview that he did with Tom Voigt in the early 2000s is, I'm paraphrasing, mind you, but Tom Voigt would ask a question something like, oh, was Arthur Lee Allen a fan of light opera? And Don Cheney would say, no, he wasn't, but I was. Again, dropping hints and suggestions that he was the killer. But as far as the word cogitate, the reason why it's used in the story of the Savoy Opera is it's telling the tale of the inspiration for the Macato, and that there was a Japanese sword that was hanging on the wall as a decoration, and that fell to the ground. And then Arthur Sullivan immediately has the idea for the Macato, or he gets inspired, so to speak. But the book page that Drew Beeson had shared with me was actually from a different book that was quoting the story of the Savoy Opera. And it wanted to set the record straight and provide some additional information that it's somewhat of an urban myth that the sword actually fell from the wall. Perhaps you can think of some other similar stories, like maybe Isaac Newton and the apple, or just how some stories can be half true and half false. Now, what that book wanted to say was the story of the Savoy Opera tells a half-truth, that, yes, Arthur Sullivan looked at the sword on the wall, this wall decoration, this Japanese sword, and he began to cogitate. He began to think deeply and meditate on the idea, and they thought of the idea for the Macato by him, meaning Gilbert and Sullivan. But the thing about the sword falling from the wall and he just has this immediate light bulb moment didn't actually happen. It's, again, a piece of information that is half true and half false. Now I'd like to move on to the next segment here on Black Box Online Radio, And I have to give a shout out to Andrew WVA, who has shared something with me via the email address, BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. And Andrew, firstly, showed me some photos of West Virginia on Halloween during the snowstorm that they had. I am now in the Philippines, but practically a lifelong West Virginian, always missing the place, and much appreciated. But the thing that Andrew really wanted to share was in relation to a voice sample of Richard Gaikowski, another Zodiac killer suspect. And this is actually from the South Dakota Farmers Union. Richard Gaikowski was from Watertown, South Dakota. And the Zodiac killer was reported to have had a very unusual voice, a very unusual speaking pattern. And I'm going to play that for you in just a second. And I want you guys to think about that. Some of the other ways that the Zodiac voice has been described by Nancy Slover, who heard the Zodiac, was that he spoke in a monotone, not any type of noticeable regional accent, but he had a very bizarre speaking cadence. The word speaking cadence gets talked about all the time with the Zodiac. Brian Hartnell, the victim at Lake Berryessa who survived, also said that the Zodiac did not have any type of recognizable regional accent, but he had an unusual way of speaking, and he thought that if he heard the voice again, he would definitely be able to recognize it. Before I play the clip, though, I would like to remind you that Andrew sent this to me via BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. You can also get in touch with me on Facebook. My Facebook's in the description box, BlackBoxNed88 over on Instagram, and you can also go through some of the other links in the description box. One of them is for BuyMeACoffee.com, BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNed88, which allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. But for now, I want to get back to this, and let's play the audio clip.
Form can be answered by the driller after completing the test. Water for domestic use, livestock use, and for irrigation of plots of land up to 1/2 acres can be diverted from a stream or pumped from wells without obtaining a permit. Over the last 6 years, patrons of the typical local cooperatives affiliated with the Farmers Union Central Exchange have received an average of 10.5 cents in savings for every dollar they've spent on farm supplies. This was revealed in a recent survey conducted by the Farmers Union Accounting Service of over 400 local retail cooperatives. A large measure of these savings, says the report, came from the operations of Central Exchange, fully controlled by these home-owned cooperatives. And now one final note in today's news. While the price level increased 1% over the year ago, the prices farmers paid for goods and services increased by 2%. And the farmer's share of the consumer dollars remains the same, 38 cents. Thank you.
And one more time, that was the sound of Richard Gaikowski's voice. Some of the things that I noticed immediately is that he does sound unusual, and I am not the best at recognizing regional accents. For example, one thing that Andrew pointed out in his email is that Richard Gaikowski had a very noticeable Midwestern accent. If you had played that audio clip for me and just did not share anything about the South Dakota Farmers Union or did not share anything about Richard Gaikowski's background, and you were to ask me, what kind of voice does this guy have? And I would just say, I don't know, somewhere in North America, because I am very honest about that. I can't always differentiate the sound, but I definitely would be able to recognize a Southern accent or maybe some of the New England regionalities that are more pronounced or more distinct, but I would describe that as unusual. Also, that does match up with what Nancy Slover described about the monotone voice, and I can only gather that he's not trying to be overly enthusiastic or overly flamboyant or overly loud or overly boisterous, because he's giving a presentation for the South Dakota Farmers Union, and he's talking in that particular style for a very specific reason. But I'm always reminded of what Brian Hartnell said about how if he heard the voice again, he could recognize it because it was very distinct. Now, I'm going to provide a little bit of skepticism, and this is my own unprofessional response. This is my own unprofessional take on the subject, but I think a big problem with looking at voice samples like this and trying to match it to what Brian Hartnell and Nancy Slover described is, I don't think that the Zodiac Killer was using his real voice when he was talking on the phone calls or talking to Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard at Lake Berryessa. And the reason why I say this is because over time I've come to the conclusion that I believe the Zodiac Killer was completely in persona mode. I think that he was acting out a part. You could view it the way that an actor is performing a role, but you could also view it the way a kid is playing a game, some type of imaginary game, or some type of fantasy-filled game where he's acting like the Zodiac Killer. And I don't think that he was talking in his own natural voice. I think that he was altering his voice in some way, so it made it sound different. So if you're just going to listen to any ordinary clip of Richard Gaikowski talking about the South Dakota Farmers Union, maybe it wouldn't sound exactly the same. But feel free to dispute that with me in the comment section down below. I would love to know what you guys think. Is that how you imagine the Zodiac Killer to sound? Or are you more in line with somebody like me who thinks that the Zodiac was altering his voice on the phone calls and in the conversations, primarily because he didn't want his voice to be recognized, because he didn't want his voice to, well, he's not going to use his real voice, because then it would be obvious that someone could recognize the sound of it for simplicity's sake. Now, Richard Gaikowski and Don Cheney come up a lot because they are also suspects that have been discussed by Tom Voigt of ZodiacKiller.com. And somebody asked me a recent question here in the comment section on YouTube by saying that Tom Voigt has Richard Gaikowski as his Zodiac Killer suspect. Why did Tom Voigt choose Richard Gaikowski over Don Cheney? And just to possibly speak on someone's behalf, it is my understanding that Tom Voigt did indeed look into Don Cheney as a Zodiac Killer suspect, and he was the one who was responsible for Don Cheney's fingerprints, handwriting, and DNA all being taken by law enforcement. However, when none of the findings came back, either conclusive, confirmed, or positive, Tom Voigt then began to think that Don Cheney was not the Zodiac. In a comment here on BlackBoxOnlineRadio, he stated very clearly that he does not say that Don Cheney was exonerated, but he says simply that Don Cheney's handwriting, fingerprints, and DNA did not match. And as I understand, that just means that law enforcement did not make an arrest, or they did not report that they had any conclusive findings with Don Cheney's forensic material, and he began looking at other suspects, particularly Richard Gaikowski, whom he has settled on, and these are interpretations of the evidence that people will make, because we all have to admit that this is an unsolved case, an unsolved mystery. And you can hear Don Cheney's voice on the documentaries that he's talking about. One of them that I discussed was, his name was Arthur Lee Allen, and you can watch that here on YouTube, and you can think about how Don Cheney sounds. You can also think about how Arthur Lee Allen sounds. We have media of him, and there are several media clips of Richard Gaikowski. But I would love to know, what did you guys think about Richard Gaikowski's voice? Please answer down below. So I think that the person who created the Zodiac Killer persona was very simply trying to get into character because he enjoyed it. I think that that was one of the things that this guy focused on. He wanted to have a type of game to play, and the game was to get into the Zodiac persona, like the way that a kid would almost play make-believe or something, the way that a kid would almost play an imaginary game. So that's my pure take on the subject, and I could be completely wrong, but after looking at some pieces of the evidence, I think the Zodiac was intentionally altering his voice. That's why it sounds weird. So, I mean, I do think that Gaikowski sounds like what the witnesses said, but who knows what the Zodiac's natural speaking voice would have sounded like. What do you think about the suspects mentioned so far, Donald Lee Cheney and Richard Gaikowski? And in the next segment, we're going to take things in a completely different direction. Firstly, I would like to give a shout out to longtime BBOR follower Batman66, who sent something into the Facebook page, and it relates to a Zodiac Killer suspect whom I've never examined before, and his name is William Thorson. He is the subject of the book Zodiac Maniac by Glenn Wall. This is a different type of Zodiac theory, because it actually relates to another book that has been written by Glenn Wall called Sympathy Vote, and it talks all about how a woman was murdered named Valerie Percy, and could this person, William Thorson, have been a suspect in the murder of Valerie Percy, and then go on to have been the Zodiac Killer? Well, let's look at it. Let's look at everything that Glenn Wall has shared. Again, his first book is called Sympathy Vote, and then it goes into Zodiac Maniac. But the story doesn't truly begin there, because we have to go back to 1957 with a different crime that William Thorson gets accused of, and this theory that he committed pre-Zodiac crimes and then went on to be the Zodiac Killer. And it's the 1957 murder of Judith Mae Anderson, who was a 15-year-old girl, also from the Midwest, and she was murdered, her body was dismembered, and placed into an oil drum. Now, before I say anything further, I have to be very, very blunt and just say that longtime BBOR followers will know that I am horribly, horribly skeptical of anything that deals with these types of details having a connection to the Zodiac Killer mystery. The Zodiac Killer murdered David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen at Lake Herman Road and just left the bodies there. He murdered Darlene Ferrin and shot Mike Mageau at Blue Rock Springs Park, didn't even make sure that Mike Mageau was dead. The Zodiac had the opportunity to have Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard tied up at Lake Berryessa, and he didn't mutilate their bodies at all. He stabbed them, but he didn't viciously mutilate them. And of course, murdering Paul Stein in a taxi cab. I don't see an ounce of profiling accumulation that should point us toward the Zodiac committing crimes like this. An absolute tragedy about what happened to Judith Mae Anderson, 15-year-old girl being murdered, cut up, and thrown into an oil drum. When I say dismembered, some of her body parts were found in the oil drum, but her head was not, and just absolutely saddening, but I don't think that it's Zodiac related. Now we're going to go over to an article from Classic Chicago magazine that says, "Has the murder of Valerie Percy finally been solved?" And this is written by David A.F. Sweet, just citing the source. And it says, "Cold cases enjoy a timeless appeal that's especially true on the North Shore of Chicago, which unsolved murders are incredibly rare. The most infamous one gathered national coverage. Valerie Percy was an attractive, friendly Cornell graduate, and she lay asleep in the bed in her Kenilworth home one night in September of 1966, the daughter of a Bell and Howell executive, Charles Percy, who was running as a Republican for the U.S. Senate. She had worked hard that summer on her father's campaign. He called her his best precinct captain, but that night the 21-year-old was both beaten and bludgeoned with a bayonet. Her killer had bolted after stabbing her 14 times. From the Sheridan, nothing from the Sheridan Road home was stolen. Residents across from the North Shore were stunned. W. Clement Stone ordered bulletproof glass installed in his lakefront mansion. Even today, all of us mourn her loss, and the Percys were forced to live through a very big tragedy. Glenn Wall lived only 1 mile away in Wilmette. When Valerie was killed, he was 3 years old, and he knew nothing about the vicious slaying at the time because of his age, but he has authored 2 well-researched books, Sympathy Vote and Zodiac Maniac, that both make strong cases that an extremely disturbed man murdered Valerie and got away with it before his own wife murdered him. Wall's prime suspect is William Thorson, and he found plenty of trouble in his adolescent years. William Thorson was born in 1937. Here's a summary, gleaned from Wall from police and newspaper accounts. When William Thorson was 13 years old, police warned him to stay away from the Kenilworth family, who complained about him. From a Kenilworth family, excuse me, that's the name of the town. The following year, Thorson was caught inside a neighbor's home more than once without permission. After more troubling behavior, his family placed him in a mental ward at Michael Reese Hospital in Chicago, one of at least 3 trips to the mental hospitals that he experienced in his life. But he escaped, returned home, locked himself in a room with a gun, and said he would kill anyone who entered. A few years later, he married a woman named Louise Bonnick. Lest one think domestic bliss would change his nature, Thorson soon was charged with the assault of a Kenilworth man. And that was in the 1950s. In the next decade, his mother Kay filed assault and battery charges against him. He later tried to stage a murder-suicide in his parents' home and blame it on his father, who was also named William. William Thorson, the suspect, is actually William Thorson III. His father would have been William Thorson II. And William Thorson II had founded the Great Western Steel Company in Chicago. As Glenn Wall traces Thorson's movements in Zodiac Maniac, Thorson faced federal charges after an arms raid found 70 tons of munitions in his San Francisco home, including bayonets. Wall makes a persuasive case that Thorson was also the Zodiac killer. Now, I'm going to have to jump ahead a little bit, but because I want to get to the heart and soul of this issue. I want to just tackle this thing head on. William Thorson was a horrible person, and that is beyond debate. That's a quotation from the article here. But did he murder Valerie Percy? A World War II bayonet, without any rust, did wash up on the shore of Lake Michigan a few days after the murder. 3 months later, Thorson's wife was arrested by the FBI for trying to ship him weapons, including 3 bayonets identical to the one found near the Percy house. Well said, Wall said Valerie's wounds were consistent with the bayonet, a fact confirmed by her pathologist Joe DeLeonardi, a Chicago homicide detective who was dispatched to Kenilworth. Two of the victims of the Zodiac killer were killed with a bayonet. Well, I mean, that is referring to... Wait a second, that's referring to Cecilia Shepard and Brian Hartnell. One victim was killed with a bayonet. Some people believe that the Zodiac killer had a bayonet at Lake Berryessa. Other people tend to think that it was more of a hunting knife, and that ties back into the Don Cheney theory, because one of the points that I didn't read from the article, because I was just trying to save time, was that Don Cheney was an avid hunter. He was also a leather worker, and he could make things like the sheath that the knife would go in. And I mean, in a lot of other sources, I've seen the claim that the Zodiac killer was carrying a bayonet at Lake Berryessa. I don't necessarily know if they are able to say that 100% that that's what type of blade it was. It could have been a similar blade. There are other similar knives out there that would have had length and the similar blades, but I should also point out, in counterbalance, that medical examiners are often very good at looking at the different types of blades, especially experienced medical examiners. We hear a lot from them in true crime cases all the time. Now, so let's just say one of the victims was killed with a bayonet, and another one suffered wounds. I'm altering that sentence to be fair. Despite all of this evidence, it seems Thorson cannot be placed at the scene. At the same time, Wall tears apart theories about other suspects, including a Sun-Times series that won the Pulitzer Prize in the 1970s that named a Chicago mobster as Percy's killer. Plenty of bizarre twists mark Percy, the Percy case. Though the FBI labeled Thorson as a suspect after arresting his wife, agents never shared information with the Illinois authorities. Dr. Robert Hofe was called by Percy right after they found Valerie's body, and Hofe says that Hofe saw Valerie's mutilated body moments later, since he lived nearby, even though Wall pointed out in a newspaper article that investigators said they interviewed about 10,000 people in the first 2 years of the case. They never interviewed Hofe. Wall, who originally was going to write a book about Senator Percy's campaigns, was then drawn into the murder. Well, I give him credit for having some original curiosity. One more time, his book is called Sympathy Vote. And I'm going to share some things about him being a Zodiac killer suspect in just a second, and it relates to the end of his life. But also, just from reading this article, let's say if these details that have been shared in the article are correct, then this is actually a very strong suspect for the murder of Valerie Percy, someone who's not only beaten but also stabbed with the bayonet. What I meant to say is, she's not only stabbed with the bayonet, but she's also beaten and bludgeoned with it. This guy had history of mental health, impulse control, and this whole thing about how he has made multiple attempts in his life to secure bayonets or have them ordered or be in the possession of them. Even that one story involving his wife. If all of those details are true, I think that he would be a strong suspect for the murder of Valerie Percy. And I know I was saying some skeptical things at the beginning about suspects like Don Cheney and Richard Gaikowski, and you guys know that with the Zodiac killer case, I'm very naturally skeptical about all of the suspects, but I want to be very clear about something. I don't dislike all true crime theories, and when I hear something about how the body of Judith Mae Anderson is found in an oil drum, I'm just like, absolutely, that's a different type of crime. The Zodiac didn't do anything like that. Beating and bludgeoning a woman with a bayonet? Well, Cecilia Shepard was tied up at Lake Berryessa. More or less, she wasn't beaten and bludgeoned with the bayonet, if the Zodiac did indeed have one. She wasn't beaten with the hilt of the knife or the handle or any type of markings like that, to the best of my knowledge. And I just think that this attack on Valerie Percy is, again, a tragedy, but I don't think it's Zodiac related, but Glenn Wall may have identified the suspect there. Now, this is some important stuff in regards to looking at William Thorson as a Zodiac killer suspect. Fast forward to 1970, one night his wife Louise claimed Thorson confessed to 3 murders, including that of his younger brother Richard, who was killed by a single gunshot to the head in Lake Forest, in 1965. He did not confess to murdering Valerie Percy. Soon after, he said he needed to kill her since she now knew. Instead, Louise shot him dead. A New York Times article a few years later was entitled, life with a wealthy, sadistic, murderous lunatic, and cited statements from Louise that he beat her repeatedly, stabbed her, and raped her. Now, I'm not going to dispute any of those details of personal suffering that she experienced. However, I do want to look at this date. So, William Thorson III is murdered in 1970. Okay, let's say he's killed in 1970, because based on her story, it could have been self-defense. He is killed in 1970 by his wife. The Zodiac Killer went on to write letters into 1971. The Zodiac Killer would resurface writing letters in 1974. I think that the only way that Glenn Wall could make his theory work for the book Zodiac Maniac would be if he were some way, somehow trying to say that there was a different letter writer. There was a different person responsible for the creation of the letters and the ciphers. I mean, I think that's the only way he could truly examine that, because, I mean, well, there are correspondences that came after 1970. How about the 1971 Pleasanton letter? And, of course, the 1974 Exorcist letter. Then we have other possible communications. And somebody was asking me about this recently. It was actually from my most recent interview with Stuart McAdam, which came out on the Friday segment. As I said, interviews are going to be coming out on Fridays, sometimes Tuesdays. The Tuesday interviews are going to be talking about anything related to a true crime, mostly focusing on serial killers. But I'm trying to move a lot of the Zodiac Killer interviews to the Friday segment, which used to be the Anything Goes Fridays episode. And if you would like to follow along with all of these true crime discussions, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And as previously mentioned, visit some links in the description box. But I was discussing this with Stuart McAdam, talking about which letters do you think were authentic, like the unconfirmed communications. And in the past, I thought there was a high chance that the 1986 letter was authentic, but then I kind of moved away from that one, and definitely looking at the 1978 letter, as well as the 1974 Count Marco letter, the one that ends with Red Phantom, saying Red Phantom, red with rage. So I think that that's a high chance that it could have been written by the same person who wrote the Zodiac Communications from 1969. Well, that would mean that it wasn't William Thorson III, because he was dead, and people often propose suspects that died in 1975. Ross Sullivan even died in 1977, and there are other suspects that are a little bit lesser known, like Tony Tola died in 1974. So with this type of theory, you really have to shape the facts in a particular way to make Glenn Wall's Zodiac Maniac theory fit, and I don't necessarily know if he succeeds in that, but I will give Glenn Wall some credit. It does appear that he has a certain amount of credibility to his theory involving the murder of Valerie Percy. But I do have one final note for you, and it relates to a comment that was made in the documentary The Myth of the Zodiac Killer, which came out earlier this year. And we had one of the members of law enforcement, Dave Collins, saying that we should not be looking at the Presidio Heights sketch of the Zodiac Killer, the one that has the light-colored hair and the glasses that was done after the Stein murder on October 11th of 1969. He believes that the Zodiac Killer actually looked like the Lake Berryessa sketch, the one that's done with the Lake Berryessa voyeur that has the hair that's combed over to one side, whereas the Presidio Heights sketch, the more famous one, that has the crew cut, and it has a little bit of a narrow face. I mean, what I think the Presidio Heights sketch is more about is the killer has wide cheekbones, and then the chin comes down into more of a narrow point, whereas the Lake Berryessa voyeur seems to have a relatively square face and a very, very different hairline. Now, some people think that, well, the killer was wearing a hood at Lake Berryessa, a hood, excuse me. Yes, he wore a hood. The killer was wearing a wig at Lake Berryessa when he was looking at three girls, and that's why he gets named the Lake Berryessa voyeur, as well as underneath the Lake Berryessa hooded costume. One proponent of this theory is Kevin Robert Brooks, who talks about his Zodiac suspect Donald Lee Booyock, and that's why he looks a little bit different. It's because he was wearing a wig, and he also said that the hair was described by the girls as being very neat, almost fake. And Robert Graysmith even talks about how he thought that the Zodiac was wearing a wig at Lake Berryessa. I almost said a hood. That's like a muscular memory issue, because I often talk about the Lake Berryessa hooded costume. But if Collins is right, then the Zodiac would indeed resemble someone who looks like William Thorson. He looks nothing like the Presidio Heights sketch, but he does resemble the Lake Berryessa voyeur to a certain extent. What do you think about William Thorson as a Zodiac suspect? I'm probably going to give him a 2 out of 10, only because of the critical things that I've stated. And the previously mentioned thing, maybe in some variant, he didn't write all the letters or the ciphers, and he didn't design any of that stuff, and he actually resembles the Lake Burrier Savoyer, and that he was a mentally unstable, homicidal individual. 2 out of 10. But what do you guys think about William Thorson III as a Zodiac killer suspect? And right now, I would like to get to your shout-outs. As previously stated, anybody who makes a donation or contribution on BuyMeACoffee.com will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday, and our first one comes to us from Batman66. Thank you so much for your regular and consistent support. You are amazing. Second one comes to us from River Prawn Pottery, another regular supporter. Greatly appreciate. You guys don't know how beneficial this is to the channel. And our next one comes to us from Quentin Broom. BuyMeACoffee.com has a message saying, thanks, great info and research. This is just my normal life now. I mean, always going to try, though. Quentin, thank you. And next we have one from Ray Grant. Ray Grant, author of Zodiac Killer Solved, as well as the novel Zodiac Killer Dreams. Ray Grant says, hi, Ned. I look forward to our interview session. Talk to you soon. And that kind of gives away the surprise, but Ray Grant will be a future guest on Black Box Online Radio. I'm trying to have more guests on the program. Going to be talking to Zodiac writers and researchers, as well as people who follow other true crime cases. And also a previous guest on the program, Stuart McAdams, says, keep up the great work. And to be very clear, these guys absolutely did not have to donate on BuyMeACoffee.com to come on the show. There's never, ever going to be any charge to do something like that. They simply wanted to say thank you for being invited on and supporting the channel. And thank you so much to you guys. And our final shout out comes to us from Jeff Jones, who says, excellent content and delivery. And thank you so much to everybody who has been tuning into Zodiac Monday. And one day, I hope that we're going to have a Zodiac Monday episode when I say, the case has been solved. Case cracked. All right. We know who did it. We know who the Zodiac Killer was. And even if we don't get all of the questions answered, we'll be able to look at the Zodiac crimes that took place. The Lake Herman Road murders, the Blue Rock Springs shooting, the Lake Burrier stabbing, the Stein murder. And we'll be able to say one person was responsible for that. Now, this brings up a host of other issues. What do we do with all of the unconfirmed crimes going back to 1962 and 63 and 64 and 66? Who was that? I've also had some very troubling moments recently as a true crime follower. And this is purely just because I've been going down the rabbit hole of other cases. And the Zodiac Killer is rather mild compared to some of these other people. Like, I mentioned a serial killer briefly on my live stream that came out on Thursday. Every Thursday I do a live stream here on Black Box Online Radio, and his name was Arthur William Hodge. And he was a torturer from the colonial era who tortured his slaves. He would pour boiling water down people's throats until they were dead. He placed a 10-year-old boy into boiling alcohol, and he was a deranged individual. He was hanged for torturing his slaves, and that was just the tip of the iceberg about how I just began reading other stories of very, very horrendous crimes. And one of them that just came up in my search feed was the Hello Kitty murder, and I did a short on that episode. I did a short episode on that story of a woman named Fan Man Yi who was murdered in Hong Kong, and she was tortured for 27 days, forced to eat excrement and drink urine, and then she was decapitated, and her skull was placed inside a Hello Kitty mermaid doll. Just shocking things. And then I was reminded of a story from people in the comment section, which I have heard before. In the case of Junko Furuta in Japan, the woman that was tortured for 44 days. And I remember an episode of Rob Dyke when he said that that would be the absolute worst punishment that he could think of, what Junko Furuta experienced, just about being raped over 500 times while she's being held captive. Men are just invited over to sexually assault her, being placed in a refrigerator for hours, then being burned. And I mean, it's just utterly shocking cases of what people do to each other. What human beings do to other human beings. And I'm somebody who runs a true crime channel. I talk to you guys about this stuff almost 7 days a week. But some things never cease to to just shock me, for lack of a better term. And there's no limit to human cruelty and brutality. And when you look at somebody like the Zodiac Killer, the Zodiac was a little bit of a coward and a weakling, and someone who is just doing nasty things. Not only nasty things in terms of making the taunts letters, he was indeed a murderer. Absolutely, the Zodiac was a murderer. But he isn't even focused so much on torturing people. He just wants to scare people. That's why I use the term nasty things, because the Zodiac is trying to get the image of fear into the public within the Bay Area, and then it would expand nationwide. And, I mean, when you actually look at these horrible cases of what I had just been talking about, the Zodiac seems like a rather mild and weak person in terms of just what he would be thinking about and fantasizing about. And there's also something that I want to share with you guys in conclusion, and it relates to a story about the murder of James Overvold. And last week on the channel I was talking to you about how I had started the book Homicide, The View from Inside the Yellow Tape by Cloyd Steiger. Cloyd Steiger was a homicide detective, and he wrote this book as a memoir. And James Overvold was murdered by one of his roommates. He was shot, and then a brass marijuana pipe was placed into one of the wounds, and then the drawers in his bedroom were pulled out, and they just did some investigations, they did some questioning, and one of his other roommates was arrested for the crime, and ultimately he confessed. He confessed. They had some type of dispute going on, but he confessed that he murdered him, he shot him, he inserted the brass marijuana pipe into the wound, which is definitely a bizarre and sickening thing, nothing compared to the previous murders that I was just talking about, but a little bit gruesome. And he wanted to make the scene stage like a drug dealer had murdered him, but he cracked. He caved under pressure. And that's ultimately what I'm going at, because when we look at the Zodiac Killer, the Zodiac is someone who doesn't seem to fault under pressure at all. Look at all these years that have gone by. Not even a deathbed confession from someone. Look at all the years that have gone by. And, well, I was about to say no one has confessed to someone indirectly. Oh, there are loads of confessions indirectly. I take that one back. And let's look at some of those for an example. For example, Arthur Lee Allen allegedly confessed to the Seawaters that he was the Zodiac to Dave and Connie Seawater. More or less, I believe it's a deathbed confession that was done by telephone, which wasn't exactly on his deathbed, but shortly prior to his passing. And then we also have stories like Randy Kenny receiving a confession from Louis Myers saying that he was the Zodiac, write a book and donate the proceeds to the victims' families. Okay, people say they've had these types of deathbed confessions, but definitely the suspect hasn't come forward and just cracked down. All right, I can't do it anymore. I murdered these people. I feel so bad. Here's what happened. And actually provided the evidence to support all of that. No, absolutely not. And I was discussing this last week when I was mentioning the segment from Cloyd Steiger's book about the murder of Constance Murray, who was killed by her son. And again, he confessed to the crime. They had the murder weapon. They had his fingerprints on the murder weapon, although she was stabbed. And with the murder of James Overvold, he was shot. And there actually was a very bizarre twist in that case. For example, the prosecution was looking at how the defense was concocting something about how there were two guns that would have been found. One gun that was used to commit the murder of James Overvold, and a second gun was found underneath the bed where James Overvold's body was. And then they have this confession, but then the defense team has the ability to say, wait a second, he just confessed under stress, he confessed because he didn't know what he was saying. Atypical defense like that. There was another gun that was found, and Cloyd Steiger, the author of the book, was actually the detective that pointed out that it would have been impossible for the gun underneath the bed to have been used because it didn't contain a firing pin, and he made a demonstration on the witness stand by taking a pencil, placing it into a gun with a firing pin, and he showed how he can shoot it and send the pencil to the ceiling, when it didn't have the firing pin, it wouldn't fly at all, so meaning that there's no possible way that the other gun was used in the crime, and it was the gun that was handled by the defendant that was responsible for the murder of James Overvold. So I think that some cases deal with people who can't deal with the pressure, And I even remember this from the story when I was watching the movie Bully, the Ultimate High School Revenge. And I haven't done an episode about that here on this channel, but that was a movie that I watched as a teenager that really stood out to me about some teenagers that plan a murder, and one of them is just overwhelmed with guilt, and they just want to come forward, and they have to tell somebody. And a case that I have explored on this channel is the murder of Elise Paler from 1996 in Arroyo Grande, California, which was committed by three teenage boys. And again, one of them just feels overwhelmed with guilt and shame, and he has to come forward and he has to say something. And you see this rather clearly with whether it's the murder of Constance Murray or the murder of James Overvold. Some people can't handle the pressure. Maybe they also don't care, so they're not afraid of going to jail. In those examples from Cloyd Steigert's book, that could be a factor. But with the Zodiac killer, absolutely not. The Zodiac did not want to go to prison. I believe that. Number two, the Zodiac didn't feel any shame, guilt, or remorse. And I think this goes to show that the Zodiac was either a psychopath or a sociopath. But what do you think? You guys can put your ideas in the comment section down below. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there was always BlackBoxNed88 over on Instagram. And I will see you over there. Goodbye.